Hey, hello, everyone, and welcome to our office hours presentation of inflation, the supply chain, and COVID, how the U.S. might traverse an uncertain business environment. My name is Amy Oland. I'm the Assistant Director of Professional and Continuing Education here at Oakland University. I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping things before we get started. Attendees will remain muted throughout the discussion, but if you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A function at any time, and we will answer questions time permitting, and they can be submitted anonymously. If you would like to view closed captioning or subtitles, please click on the three dots next to more at the bottom of the Zoom window and click show subtitles. And this presentation is being recorded and we'll send it out to attendees next week. So that being said, I'm going to kick it over to Dave Dulio, Director of the Center for Civic Engagement, to formally get us going.
Thanks, Amy. Welcome, everybody. Glad you're here for another edition of Office Hours. If you're new to this session, what we try to do is actually a number of things. One is highlight Oakland University faculty. We have any number of experts on any number of topics here on campus, and we combine that expertise with what we think are important or interesting or hot topics, if you will. And we've got a great topic today and two great guests with us, Janelle Townsend and Michael Greiner. I will introduce our guests quickly, and then we'll just get right into it. So leading off, Janelle Townsend is a professor of marketing and international business here at OU. She's the chair of the management and marketing department. She's taught at a number of different institutions, including the University of Zurich, the Technical University of Vienna, Wayne State, as well as MSU. She is an expert in global marketing strategy, especially within the nexus of branding, innovation, and globalization. She regularly consults and collaborates with major global automotive OEMs, suppliers, and market research firms. Mike Greiner is an assistant professor of management, and he's got what I think is a really interesting background as someone who is interested in applied politics. Mike combines practical experience with his academic training. And in fact, he says for him, academics is actually his third career. The first one is where he worked in local government in politics, serving as deputy mayor of Warren, which is Michigan's third largest city. He also practiced bankruptcy law, founding his own firm, which grew to more than 10 folks, 10 employees at its height, and he helped thousands of families and businesses restructure their debts to help them turn crisis into success. So welcome, Janelle and Mike. How about we just get right into it and start talking economy, supply chain, inflation, COVID, right? And they all sort of come together. But, you know, maybe we take a sort of a 30,000 foot view first, right? Let me just ask you, from a broad perspective, how's the economy doing now? Because we see a couple different arguments, right? And Mike has got some certainly experience and expertise in politics as well. And that's sort of how I approach it, right, as a political scientist. But because we see different competing arguments about how the economy is doing. So what do you guys think?
Well, why don't I get started? It's funny that you asked that, because this is actually a question my wife asked me just the other day, and it just shows how much misinformation is out there. The economy actually is doing amazingly well right now overall by virtually any measure. The gross domestic product is growing very rapidly. The unemployment is down to practically pre-pandemic levels. The labor force participation level is actually rather high. The groups that it's lower in, which has kind of led to this issue of having fewer employees available. You know, we've all heard about the issues of getting enough employees for different jobs. The groups that have been most impacted by this are really older folks, many of whom have decided to retire, it appears, rather than going back to work. They decided, you know, after having been off as a result of the COVID shutdowns, that they just didn't want to go back to their jobs. So we see lower labor force participation among older folks. And among women, who actually have been hit pretty hard by a lot of the issues with children, not being able to be cared for in daycare, and with schools being shut down periodically. That's been a real hardship, particularly on women, which has lowered their labor force participation a little bit. But among men, in their prime working years, the labor force participation is as high as it was prior to the pandemic right now. So we've really bounced back very quickly from the crisis. And the big issue, of course, is inflation, which everybody's concerned about. But I actually just saw this morning reports that were reported in the Wall Street Journal about the fact that now we're in the third month of declining inflation. So while inflation is still growing, it's growing at a slower pace. And in fact, most economists right now are predicting that inflation really should be slowing pretty substantially in the next few months. And that probably is a reflection over the fact that, really the market forces are addressing the labor, the supply chain issues that we've been dealing with. So I'll let Janelle pick up there.
Oh, thanks, Michael. Yeah, and the Wall Street Journal article is kind of interesting when you juxtapose that with today's headline of 7.5% inflation for last month. So this is something that is going to, take off in what everyone's going to talk about. And a lot of times it's those perceptions that matter as much as what's really happening in the hard numbers. So those subjective ways that people are thinking about inflation and getting very concerned about this. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we haven't seen inflation like this in, a generation. In my adult life, I've never dealt with inflation. And people from my mom's generation will say, well, mortgage rates were 16% when I bought my first house, right? Well, my first house, they were at 8.5%, and all it's done is gone down since. And so we've been in an era that's very different from what previous eras were. And so I think it's going to take some adjustment for people to understand that, inflation isn't necessarily unusual. It's just a different era that we're in.
So Janelle, something you said there really crystallized this for me in an interesting way. So you said that inflation, you haven't experienced it in your adult life. So that makes me wonder, right? And we've got some students that are part of the webinar today. What is inflation? Can you just give us a quick definition of that? Because if it's something that we haven't experienced in so long, right? Maybe a lot of folks really don't even know what it is.
So I don't have a technical definition off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's fine.
Please keep in mind, I'm not an economist. So that's, there's economists out there who might, get on me about one of the words or some way that I would put this. But, it's really that you're seeing rising prices. It's when you have more currency chasing fewer goods. And boy, didn't we hit that with the pandemic. Right, we shut down the entire economy. It hasn't even come back into full swing yet because only pieces of it have come back at different points in time, especially because of global supply chains, which is another part of our topic for today. And getting, different parts of the world are coming back online in different ways in different phases. So we're seeing these, snarling of the supply of things, but yet at the same time, the demand has been just off the charts for things. And a lot of that has to do with so much money being pumped into the economy. It's important to remember that money goes into the economy in two different ways. One through, overall economic policy is a function of two things. Is one, fiscal policy, which is the government spending. And then there's the monetary policy, which is the Federal Reserve. So we're getting a lot of talk about the Federal Reserve right now and what are they going to do with interest rates, because that's what they're going to use as their main tool to kind of put the brakes on and slow things down. Okay, we've got all this money out there chasing too few goods. So, would we have seen the same inflation had we had the normal supply chain and the normal amount of goods available for people? Perhaps not. But then again, we wouldn't have had all this money pumped in the system either. Right, this was emergency reaction.
Yeah.
So
actually,
in terms of, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in too. I mean, part of the issue too is kind of the change in how people are consuming things. We had an economy that was largely focused on services. And that really changed with the pandemic. What happened was people were less likely to go out to restaurants, for example. What they do is they'd cook at home. People were less likely to go to the gym. Instead, they'd buy a Peloton, for example. And all that changed really during all that changed as a result of the pandemic. And so what we saw is actually the amount of goods coming into the country is increasing. It's just that demand has increased at so much of a faster pace than the supply has increased that we're seeing this issue. And interestingly enough, again, we're starting to see the economy shift back as a result of the reduction in the pandemic, because actually I just saw yesterday about how Peloton is cutting back on its workforce, because here they were dealing with this enormous demand for their goods when people wanted to be able to exercise at home. But now more and more people are realizing, I can go back to the gym, and there's less demand suddenly for the Pelotons. And so much is driven just by these issues of supply demand, just the way that the market economy works.
So Janelle's touched on something, and I want to come back to that too, Mike, because I think that's a really interesting aspect of all of this, right? Is the most fundamental, right? And you're talking to a political scientist, right? The most fundamental piece of economics, right? Supply and demand. It all sort of eventually gets back to that fundamental piece, right? Let's continue on inflation though for a minute, and Janelle briefly touched on it, I think, but it deserves a bit more attention. Why now? Is it and you've laid out a couple things. How much of it is impacted by that COVID stimulus that we saw during the pandemic, where as Janelle mentioned, right, the government's pumping in a bunch of money?
I would say it's probably a combination of a couple different things that you have. You've kind of got a worst case scenario of a bunch of things coming together. One would be the incredibly high demand for goods, which really the supply chain was unprepared for. And again, that does kind of lead to the supply on the supply issue. That means we have reduced supply relative to demand. On the other side, then you've got the money being pumped into the economy. And it's not just though that the government was sending out checks to everybody, which they were, but also the fact that people didn't really have anything to spend the money on because of the pandemic. So actually we have right now a higher savings rate than we've had in quite some time in the United States. People just have more money than they have, and their debt levels are lower than they have been for quite some time. And that has to do with the fact that they have more money. So they have more money, so that increases demand. Supply is constrained as a result of the fact that there is this higher demand for goods in particular, more than the supply chain is able to manage. So that makes for a supply and demand issue. And then on the other side, there are issues with the labor force, where, as I talked about, although the unemployment rate has gone down quite a bit, labor force participation is relatively high. There is still a group of people who've decided that they just don't want to go back to work anymore for various reasons. So that has meant that you've got more demand for workers. And of course, that's driven up the cost of labor. And we've seen that everywhere. I mean, I drive down the street and I see Wendy's advertising for employees at $15 an hour. I mean, that was unheard of just a year ago. So that, of course, is going to drive up costs. And then I hate to say it, but then there's one last piece of it, which is that, there are certain businesses that are taking advantage of this. Corporate profits now are at an all-time high. And you see, the level of pay going to CEOs at all-time highs. So they've certainly been able to take advantage of the fact that there is this expectation that costs are going to be higher, and they've been able to take advantage of it.
Janelle, you want to jump in on any of that?
Oh, I just thought that's a great point, because that's something that I've been thinking a lot about, is that right now there is an opportunity for companies to use this perception of higher prices to, in fact, create higher prices. So there's pricing power that companies haven't had for a long time. Because think about, just a few years ago, we were super concerned about deflation. And what was the potential for deflation, that we could end up in a situation like what Japan ended in after the 90s, when they had, the go-go years, and they, were off the charts in their growth and development. And then all of a sudden they just went off a cliff because of deflation. And especially that has a lot to do with their aging population, which we also have something along those lines happening right now too, right? Is that we have this aging population. And so somehow you have to be able to maintain your economy with that. And they've struggled with that for the last 20 years, literally, and are, just seem to maybe be coming out of it. And then we got hit with the pandemic. So companies are using this as an opportunity because they couldn't raise prices before. In fact, they were oftentimes figuring out ways to lower prices. Here's an example. Starbucks, what was the thing? Starbucks was forced to raise prices due to inflation and supply chain issues. Also Starbucks, our profit just went up 31%, and we gave our CEOs a 39% raise to $20.4 million. So, there's that side of the angle to it that people don't, when we go to the store, we don't think about the fact that these companies are actually making more money.
Yeah.
So there's that's part of the reason why the stock market, we've had a lot of vacillation in the market lately, but it's, we haven't seen these huge drops because companies are still making money.
So let's I have one more question about inflation, and then let's get into supply chain, because we've got some audience questions coming in on that too. But Mike, you said that economists think that curve is going to go down, that inflation will start to dissipate, right? So does that mean, well, I'll ask it two ways. One, how will we know that? And I guess as part of that, will we see prices go down? Or to Janelle's point, will companies now be able to keep the prices where they are because they can?
Yeah, I think, well, let me answer that a couple of ways for starters. I want to follow up again on something actually Janelle said earlier about the psychology of what's going on out there. And this will be something that you'll find interesting, Dave, from a political science standpoint, which is psychology matters when you're talking about the economy. There are for example, we've got the U of M doing the consumer confidence survey that they do periodically, and that indicates as to how people are perceiving the economy, and the way people perceive the economy then impacts the way that they spend. If they think things are going well, then they're liable to spend more money. If they think things are not going as well, then they're liable not to spend as much, which then has a kind of rippling effect on the economy. Now, the reason I bring this up with inflation is that there's inflation also has a very serious psychological aspect to it. And what it has to do is something referred to as inflation expectations, where if people expect that prices are going to go up, then prices tend to go up. Whereas if people don't expect that prices are going to go up, then they tend to settle down because people are less willing to pay more for things. Now, the reason I bring this up is that this is measured. And what I just saw again the other day, something in the newspaper talking about, I believe it was the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, talking about how on the one hand, inflation expectations for the short term are high. People expect in the short run, inflation is going to continue to increase. But in the long run, people expect that inflation will stop. And that's kind of the reason that I think economists are really expecting that this is not going to be some kind of continuing spiral, that where the Fed's going to have to put the United States economy into a full-fledged recession to try to get control of inflation the way it did in the early 1980s, because of the fact that people seem to understand that this is a short-term issue, that things are going to settle down over time. So we don't expect this going to be ongoing, and that's really, I think, where the economists are kind of hanging their hat, that they see on the one hand, inflation is already slowing, and that's because of, again, the supply chain kind of evening out. But on the other hand, people don't expect this is going to be a long run thing. They think that this is going to stop in the shorter run rather than the long run. And then that goes on to kind of impact the way that businesses are able to price their products. Now, in terms of what we're going to see, the reality is it's very hard to get companies to lower prices. So I think the odds are you're not going to see prices lowering, but what you're going to see is start to see them stabilizing again, where it's going to be harder and harder again for businesses to raise prices the way they were. So I think you're going to see a stickiness to what we've got so far, but that businesses are going to find themselves again struggling against this pressure for cost increases on the one side, with this downward pressure on their pricing on the other side.
One
Janelle?
thing that could change that would be competition. So certain spaces where there's greater amount of competition, that's where you'll see the price pressures and things will go back down again. And you know, a lot of it will be impacted by you know, how the Federal Reserve handles taking money out of the system. That's gonna, you know, if it's, you know, it's always in fact, I've heard people talk about that they're addicted to gradualism. Where there's a reason why they're addicted to gradualism is because they don't want to freak people out and have everyone go that psychology effect, right? And thinking, oh my God, the sky is falling. And so if there's this thinking that if we do this more gradually, that people will just get used to it and it won't be such a big shock to the system. But now there's a lot of people talking about, hey, 7.5%, we need a shock to the system. So we'll see what happens with that on that side of things. But, you know, prices, I do think that as as supply stabilizes, demand will come down a little bit and we will see things go back to what's more of an equilibrium point.
We've got a bunch of questions from our audience members here, but the word you used previously, Janelle, perception, I think it's interesting to note, right? That and here's where a great crossover between, in my view, politics and business, and perception matters in both, right? And it's also a matter of you know, one of the biggest political stories these days is President Biden's declining job approval numbers. They are inextricably linked to the economy. And even though GDP is good and employment is getting better, it's inflation that everybody perceives, right? And that's what's driving those down. When in fact, right, what can the president really do about the economy? Not much, right? It's always been my thought that the president gets far too much credit for a good economy and far too much blame for a bad one, right? So,
yeah, there's not a lot of there aren't a lot of levers that can be pulled quickly.
Right. But you know, and in fact, the Fed certainly has many more than the president, right? I mean, which is, anyway, we could spend an hour on that.
But that's by design. That's by design.
Of course, absolutely.
System,
but
right?
you know, and that's where. So let's hit on that, because part of the goal with these sessions, right, is to get people information that they might not otherwise get. So you said something, Janelle, before about the Fed taking money out of the economy. What does that mean?
Well, the way, you know,
Is it just raising
supply,
interest rates so borrowing is more costly? Or is there something else?
It's actually more complicated than that, but the way that people will see it is in interest rates. But it's a lot more complicated because they you know, we've heard this term quantitative easing. That has to do with the amount of treasuries that they buy, treasury bills, and the way that they go about how they hold them. And it gets to be, you know, probably more than what we should get into right now as far as that goes, but it's more complicated than that. But how people will see it and how businesses will manage it will be with interest rates.
And of course, how they perceive it will be with interest rates.
It's
right?
going to be the bankers and the you know, some of the high level investment people that'll be dealing with sort of that background stuff that the rest of us don't necessarily see directly, but that's how we will see it, as in those interest rates.
So let's talk a little bit about the supply chain. We've got
actually, before we do that, can I just throw in one thing here? And I think this is just relevant to something that you were asking earlier, Dave, which I think is important to note, that in terms of the perceptions of the economy, one thing that is interesting to see is how inextricably linked those things are to people's political beliefs. And one of the most interesting data points I saw was how prior to the election, when President Trump was in office, you had Republicans generally thinking the economy was doing well, Democrats thinking the economy was not doing well. After the election, then you saw an almost immediate switch, even though the economy really hadn't changed at all. And so it just goes to show that now a lot of what we're perceiving is driven through the ideological lens that is driving so much of what we have in society right now.
It's everywhere, right? That polarization and division is everywhere. One of our audience members asks, was the supply chain shortage predictable? Would there have been an opportunity to better prepare for it?
That's a great question. I think that emergency planning has to always be part of, from a business perspective, how business executives manage things. There should be some kind of plan in place. Same with households. The reality is, do we all do that on a regular basis? Probably not as well as we could. We've seen some pretty big shocks to the system over, again, in my professional lifetime. We had, Y2K, which ended up being a dud, but then of course, 9/11, that was 3 or 4 days that the country and parts of the world came to a stop. But that was 3 or 4 days, not 2 years, right? It's a much of, something that, okay, we saw this, we dealt with it. We've had pieces at times where with the tsunamis that happened in the late 2000s, especially when it hit Japan, that hit a lot of electronics manufacturers. So that sort of, parallels a little bit what's happened with the chip makers, but again, not to this degree. So I don't know that with how short of notice that we had, that planning could have been done much better than what it was, especially given our pipelines and because we have these global supply chains, which is perhaps a good segue into this, is that, we do have these very long pipelines for things. And so, cutting those off so abruptly and for the period of time that we did, that's really, so could it have been planned for? Probably not to the degree that we've had. And it's more we tend to evolve more so than anticipate something that large. Shutting down.
And if I could just throw in here too, people I'm sure who are watching this have all heard economists and experts like us talking about, this is what we expect is going to happen, what we don't expect. But economics and business research and even political science, for that matter, are inexact sciences at best. The economy is so complicated and has so many different factors impacting at any given time that at best it's an educated guess that we're able to provide. And so businesses, on the one hand, they really didn't know what to expect. They could say that, we expect that people are going to shift from services to goods. But they didn't know when that was going to happen. They didn't know how much of a shift that was going to happen. They could make different guesses at it, but I don't think anybody expected the amount of the shift that was going to happen. And as Janelle pointed out, absolutely, it takes a long time for businesses to ramp up supply. It's not like they can suddenly start producing things on a dime. There's this incredibly complicated supply chain that they need to essentially gear up to a faster speed than they had going before. And that's where they're really struggling, I think.
So I think that's a good segue into another audience question from Patrick. He wants to know your thoughts on localizing or reshoring the supply chains. How could that happen? B, how long would that take? And C, based on that, right, how long before we would see any real benefit to that?
From everything I've seen, it is happening. There definitely is a certain level of reshoring happening, but I guess the best way to answer this would kind of be to refer back to something Janelle talked about earlier, which is we're really in unprecedented times now. That the last time we saw anything like this in terms of inflation was back in the early 1980s, and so entire generations have grown up never having seen any inflation at all, for all intents and purposes, or any of supply chain issues. And really, as a result of that, the entire period of the last 40 years has been a story of increasing trade and essentially shifting the supply chain overseas to the place where you have more comparative advantage, is essentially the way economists will refer to it. But I think that suddenly there's a rethinking of this, that yes, there might be a benefit from maybe getting a slightly lower cost by offshoring some purchase, but the flexibility we get by having something closer to us has now suddenly become clear. And this is suddenly a totally new data point to most businesses that's different from what they've experienced in the past. And so they have to kind of look at this change of circumstances and say, oh, maybe it does make sense to have things close to us. We need to kind of balance these issues when the concern over, oh, there could be some major disruption to the global supply chain. That was just something that people never even really thought about when they were addressing their supply chain issues.
I think they may have a little bit, those have been around for a while, right? And experienced things like 9/11. And we did see a little bit of a shift from some of those events that have happened, but not, again, these major shifts would be we just couldn't plan for something this big. The only thing that, this would be a war, another major world war, which, let's hope that doesn't happen. It's, that's something I don't want to see in my lifetime.
And nobody does, right? And in fact, another audience member, Michael, asks, if there's unfortunately a conflict or war that arises between Ukraine and Russia, could that affect supply chain? Could that affect inflation, right? And hopefully we don't have to cross that bridge, but if we do, what are the likely impacts on those two issues?
I would say the impact would be enormous. The interesting thing about it, though, is that it's not so much driven particularly by the fact that either Ukraine or Russia are huge contributors to the supply chain here in the United States. I think the bigger issue that you're going to see is more of an increase in kind of the closing in of the supply chain, where it's going to be one more factor that makes businesses afraid of engaging in a global supply chain. And frankly, that could have an upwards impact on costs. There are a lot of things we don't like about trade. Certainly it has hurt many people's employment prospects more than many people would have estimated originally. But the truth of the matter is it has led to lower prices overall. And the more that we kind of pull back from that, the more there could be certain upward pressures on prices, which could again then lead itself into inflation. All these things are related.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of if we do have a war in Ukraine, it's gas and oil prices are what's going to get hit first. Mm-hmm. So if you think prices are high now, hang on to your pocketbooks. Get ready. This is it will be pretty big. It'll be a big shock, I think. Just again, perceptions alone, even if it isn't a big event, but the thing is it will be at this point in time, right? With the buildup that they have at the borders there, it's probably not going to be something that's like what happened with Crimea. Right, where they, the rest of the world kind of went, well, okay, you can have it if you want it, and walked away. I mean, that's literally what happened. I mean, maybe from a political perspective, it could be seen differently, but that's how I see it from a business perspective. It settled down very quickly because there wasn't this huge confrontation. But the way that this has been set up right now, there's some pretty significant potential effects there. I think that.
So Janelle, you mentioned border. So let's stick with that for a second and look at the border between the U.S. and Canada. We've got the Ambassador Bridge is shut down or full of trucks. It's probably the same at the Blue Water Bridge, but we've got these trucker protests in Ottawa over COVID restrictions, seemingly spilling over into the U.S. either indirectly with traffic stopped on the bridge, which is what 25% of the Canadian to U.S. traffic comes over that bridge. I think I read that this morning. What effect will that have? If that does spill over, right, and continues, what effect will that have on things like supply chain and the U.S. economy?
Well, it's interesting you said 25, Dave, because that's the lowest number that I've seen of our trade with Canada coming over the bridge. I've seen 27, I've seen 30%. So I'm not sure if if these things are being reported for different years, but, regardless, it's a huge percent of our trade with Canada going across the Ambassador Bridge. If you think about it from a local perspective, 20% of the trade that we have with Canada is in auto parts. So, when you extrapolate that out, it works out to be somewhere around $20 to $24 billion a year in auto parts are going across the Ambassador Bridge. So that's a pretty big number when you think about it in those terms. It's also important to understand that in the supply chain and the way that, cars are developed or put together, oftentimes parts will go back and forth across the border a couple, 3 times before they actually end up in a final vehicle. So, it may not be that, there may be some compounding effect in those numbers, but regardless, it has potential to have pretty big disruption in auto production. If this continues very long. Right now, it's my understanding they've been finding some ways around. And I don't think blue water has been hit to the same degree just yet, but if it continues, I suspect it could. What I find to be fascinating about all of this is that it's coming from a country that has a 91% vaccination rate. That's what's really kind of interesting about this whole thing, right? You would expect that maybe even from us, right? From our side of the border, because we have much lower vaccination rate.
Well, and that's probably it, right? They're afraid of the Americans coming over and giving them COVID. Right? Right? That's.
I don't know if that's what, I think it was the opposite, wasn't it? That they were, it maybe, I've gotten so many different.
My understanding was the problem was that the truckers who were trucking from Canada to the United States and back were having trouble getting back across the border into Canada. And so that's why they're blocking the borders, to kind of protest that issue there.
Because they're concerned about bringing it back from the US.
Yep.
Yeah. It is, and this is and this takes us in a totally different direction, right? But I've been thinking about the what's happening in Ottawa and potentially here in the States, because you hear that there's plans for it to go to DC, right? What does this go away quickly? It doesn't seem like it in Ottawa. These truckers who have such an impact on the economy, right, have really sort of got people's attention. And what does that mean for government decision makers, and how do they listen to them, right? It's far from over in terms of this particular story. Let's see. What about, let's change directions again. A major announcement a couple weeks ago now from General Motors to invest $7 billion roughly in electrification here in a couple of places in Southeast Michigan. Can you all talk a little bit about the impact of that, whether it's from the auto industry's perspective or the economy perspective, supply chain, right? How big of a deal is that?
I think it's huge. Not only for the numbers, because the numbers are definitely big. But again, it goes back to perceptions. And I think that, Ford's announcement of their $11 billion investments in Tennessee and Kentucky in the same space, and building their biggest plant in Tennessee, which will be outside of, the Rouge plant has been one of the biggest plants, and I think the biggest in their system. It really, again, is important for sort of the morale of Southeast Michigan, the entire state, really, to keep some of that, that big auto investment here. So it, beyond just the dollars and cents that go into this, there's also those perceptions, and that we are the Motor City, right? That's what Michigan is. I just think it's funny is that people like to criticize Americans for not knowing a lot about geography. And I had a friend, actually a relative, technically land in the US years ago, and came in and said, now, what part of Detroit is Michigan in? And, because we are Detroit, right? This is how people think of us, this is how people think of Michigan. And they don't realize that, that it can't, disentangle the two, at least globally. So I think it's really important for us in many ways of both our internal sense of perceptions of the industry, and also, our global perceptions that we're still getting that investment here. So that's just one angle of this, because there's lots of different ways we can chunk that up, but that's sort of my view of why I think it's very important. Besides,
Yeah, and I think that there's also we've got a kind of a bit of a challenge going on right now, where there's a competition between essentially the tech industry versus the auto industry as to which industry is going to kind of be the leading force in the electrification of our vehicle fleet. And so far, a lot of people have thought that the tech industry seemed to be kind of leading the way. Of course, there's Tesla, but the reality is that GM actually has been at the forefront of producing electric vehicles for some time. I mean, there's of course the EV1 that was ill-fated back in the 1990s, and even while Tesla has been producing its vehicles and struggling somewhat, GM the entire time has been producing both the Volt and really on a completely electrified basis, the Chevy Bolt. Which, according to Consumer Reports, actually is a much better vehicle than anything that Tesla is producing. So the question is, are the U.S. automakers, which kind of are perceived as kind of an old world industry as opposed to a new world industry, going to be able to change that perception that, no, we are at the forefront of this electrification? And I'm betting that they're going to be able to, and one indication of that is, again, just yesterday, we saw that the truck maker Rivian, which is more of a kind of a tech side company, I think that they're mostly invested in by Amazon, that they're in big trouble. And the big issue that they're dealing with is the same issue that Tesla has been dealing with, and that frankly is what GM and Ford and Stellantis, Chrysler, whatever you want to call them, are really good at, which is producing quality vehicles. It's hard to produce a lot of quality vehicles in a relatively short period of time. This is this practice of producing something consistently and effectively is, people think, oh, that's the easy part compared to designing it. No, that's actually the hard part. And GM and Ford and Stellantis are excellent at that. And they've only gotten better at it over the past few years. So I think that that's where we're going to really start to see the Michigan 3 starting to really show their true colors.
Is there a perception component to this as well? Because this investment in these plants it's not going to come right away, right? It's going to take a while for this to get up to speed. Yet it's perceived as an immediate benefit, I think, by many, right? In addition, this issue featured heavily in Governor Whitmer's State of the State address, as we would expect. And she took a lot of credit for helping to broker that deal, again, as we would expect, and frankly, as the governor should, as well as the legislative leaders that were part of that negotiation. But how long until we see real impact?
Well, I would say, number one, coming to your point about the perception, the biggest place you can see that is obviously in the stock market, where Tesla, for example, continues to be valued at an incredible sum of money, far beyond really what they likely should be valued at, as compared to Ford or GM, which are valued at lower amounts probably than they should be valued at under the current circumstances. So perception certainly matters there. But to give GM and Ford credit in particular, this isn't something new for them. It's been a number of years now that since Mary Barra first announced that GM was going to focus on converting to an entirely electric future, I believe by 2035. Janelle could probably correct me on that. So they're not fooling around at all on this. And so this has been something that they've been working on for some time. So I think that with the investment that we're seeing, that's really just going to be part and parcel with the process that has been ongoing that GM and Ford have been engaging in.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that there's, as far as how long, I think we have to remember all of the I hate to use the term, but trickle down effects that are going to come out of these investments as well. Right. And so I had someone who is from somewhere else originally and now working here in Michigan, who made a comment the other day of, oh, well, they should be investing more in higher level type of jobs that are not necessarily just the manufacturing jobs. We should be looking at things that require a greater degree of education. Was someone from the education space. And, my thought to that was, but we have to remember of all of the engineers that are involved with that, all of the supply chain managers, all of the marketing folks, all of the, everywhere through the chain that from, conception through development and production itself, and then everything that happens after the production. There's so much involved to that really does require a high level of a highly educated workforce that's involved in that. And so that will benefit the academic community as well, as the sandwich shops, right, that are making sandwiches for the people who work there and work in all of these places, as well, everything that's involved with daily life in the way that people live. And so I think it's really important to remember that it's not always that just initial, hey, there's this, $7 billion investment in the state. It goes much further than that, because you have that multiplier effect that comes into play. So it's a big deal.
We've got about 10 minutes left. If anybody in the audience has got a question, pop it right in that Q&A box, and we'll get it asked. While we're seeing if anybody else has got questions, I've got many, but one will take us in yet another direction. But Michigan, for decades and decades, right, has been not only a famously auto-centric state, but also famously union heavy. Not too many years ago, we see Michigan become a right to work state, and unsurprisingly, union numbers dip. But from this point forward, what is the future of unions here in Michigan, or maybe even across the country?
I think I'm going to let Michael take that, because that's a little, I think, closer to his wheelhouse than mine, at least directly anyway.
Well, Dave, you're absolutely right when you point to the fact that the laws have changed, which has made it very difficult for unions to succeed. And that's the reality, which is that, we love to point to, their unions are popular or unpopular. But the real impact of that level of popularity or unpopularity is the impact that it has then upon the policymakers and their ability then to change the laws that might make it easier or more difficult for unions to organize. And the reality is that we have not had a new piece of labor legislation since the Taft-Hartley Act was passed in 1948. And since then, you've seen consistently at the federal level, the courts kind of cutting back on the ability of unions to organize and to be able to, put themselves in a good negotiating position with the employers. And we just recently saw an example of that, and I forget the name of the case, but where essentially the Supreme Court said that unions could no longer go onto farm property to try to organize migrant farm workers there. So it kind of lends the question of then what do unions do to try to organize people? And at the same time, also, you've seen in the states efforts like here we had in Michigan, as you pointed out, making it a right to work state, and also even more recently in Michigan, where they have made it so that the public employees are no longer able to essentially have what's called the negative checkoff in terms of the political contributions to the union. That was changed here following what was done in Wisconsin. And I think so. The reality is that the laws have been changed to make it more difficult for unions to organize. And we see now, I just saw some polling come through the other day that said that union favorability now is at really an all-time high relative to the last 40 or 50 years. But the laws have changed so much that unions right now are kind of back on their heels in a way that really they haven't been since, say, the early 1900s in terms of their ability to kind of negotiate and pressure employers. So The unions right now are in a tough spot. And I think what we're really going to have to see is we're going to have to see some changes occur, most likely at the federal level, before we start to see any kind of real bounce back in union power, I think.
Well, it's interesting you say federal level, because I read just yesterday that I believe Andy Levin from Michigan is going to take the lead on sponsoring legislation in Congress to let Capitol Hill staffers unionize. Not a very big slice of the workforce, but I think symbolically, right? Maybe that would be something that would get people's attention. And again, we come back to perception, right? If that is, I'd be interesting to see if that becomes law, because they obviously have to make it through the U.S. Senate, which isn't passing much these days, for reasons we will save for another edition of Office Hours. But let's switch gears and go to a question from Paulina.
Can I just throw something out there, Dave?
Yeah, go for it.
On that topic, or about unions. I would like to say one thing is that what I've observed over time is that it seems like unions evolve where, or become a bigger deal when people don't feel like they're being treated well by companies. Again, taking this back to a business perspective and more of an area that's in my space, is that if people don't feel like they're being treated well, meaning workers, that's when they go to unionize. And there's actually a lot of negative impact on a brand from not treating people who work for you well, and remembering that you're creating value, and you don't create value by strictly cutting costs, or certain segments of, so Starbucks, for example, where the CEO got a huge payout, but the workers in some of the Starbucks stores are starting to unionize. And there was just a vote in New York, I think, in one of the stores, and they voted to unionize, which is actually a really negative impact on their brand, because Starbucks has prided themselves on treating people well, and that this was a great place to work. And so I might be more inclined to spend an extra 50 cents on a cup of coffee or whatever, because I know that I'm participating with the place that's a good place, right? It's a good feel, it's a good vibe. You're not going to spend that extra 50 cents or that extra buck on someplace that you think, yeah, well, they're a bunch of schleps anyway. So it's really important for executives and leadership to understand that the way you create good brands and do business well is by having good employment policies, right? So that, and I'm not saying everybody's supposed to get paid at the same level as CEO, but that everybody, you have to be very careful about making sure that people feel like they're part of a team and part of it. And so that's, I guess, when you talk about unions and where we're going with unions, and I thought that.
Well, so that's interesting, right? So now Starbucks has two strikes against them in our little office hours, right? They're raising prices when they've got record profits, and they're sticking it to their employees, right? But how does, because I saw this morning that the city of Detroit is going to move to transition to a $15 an hour minimum wage for city employees, right? Was that kind of perception of mistreating workers or not? Maybe that's a bad way to say it. Maybe companies could treat their workers better if they paid them more. Is that where that frustration, drove from? And why do we see some companies adopt that and others not?
And I don't think it's always a matter of money. Because we're academics, I always kind of want to, put that caveat out there that I'm not a human resources expert, right? That is not my space, for sure. However, it is my space to have to understand what that means for brands and managing strategies and for brands. And so I think it's important to remember that it's the way that people feel about being part of a company or part of an organization like the city of Detroit or whatever. It's not always just about the dollars, although that's like anything else. It's like grades, right? Like, so I say, why do students care about grades? It's about the knowledge, it's about the learning. But the thing is that that's our metric, that we use. And so that's why I think the dollars and cents tend to come out a lot, is because it's a metric. It's an easy number to pick on.
Yeah. And if I could just add to that, and this kind of goes back to actually one of my former lives working in local government, and probably your interest in politics, Dave, which is that and actually really my big area of research right now, and it has to do with stakeholders. Who are the powerful forces that that a certain organization needs to be dealing with? Well, the stakeholders in a local governmental entity such as the city of Detroit are going to be very different from the stakeholders of a company such as Starbucks. For example, the way that that Starbucks is set up, and the way that every corporation in the United States is set up, is that basically the key stakeholder are the shareholders. They have 100% say pretty much over how the company operates, and the only goal of the top managers is going to be trying to please the shareholders. Now, that doesn't have to be that way. It's different in different countries, but here in the United States, that's how we do it. On the other hand, in an entity such as the city of Detroit, it has a very different set of stakeholders. Its stakeholders are the voters. Its key stakeholders are the voters and the taxpayers. And many of those voters and taxpayers are going to be unionized. And what's more is that the unions, being good at organizing their membership, would be especially good at kind of making the impact of that membership be heard especially strongly by the elected officials then in a city administration, such as with the city of Detroit. So that makes then that stakeholder group even more powerful than within the context of the governmental entity. And I think that's part of why you see this distinction between the strength of unions within the private sector, which right now is, I believe, at 6% last I saw. So it's at an all-time low right now, versus where it is still in the public sector, where I think it's about a 25% or so. So a big part of that distinction has to do with who are the powerful stakeholders and kind of what their interests are.
Well, we are right up against 1 o'clock here. I'm going to thank Janelle and Mike for their time, for Paulina, Werner, Barry. If we didn't get to your questions, I apologize, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time. Maybe in addition to thanks to Mike and Janelle, I'll ask them for one quick thought about what folks can look forward to over the next several months that they should keep an eye on, right? What should folks keep an eye on for the next several months in terms of the economy or business or inflation, et cetera?
So I think that it's important to remember that, the only constant is change. And so we are going to see some inflation, and we may not have even hit peak inflation yet. I suspect we may have a couple more months of that, but it is likely that it's going to come down thereafter. And so, just persevere. We're going to get through this. We will get through things, and just understand that, and don't get, we're so caught up right now in the 24-hour news cycle and the social media and all of the, there's a lot of hype that goes on in very short periods of time. And, something that's very important today and everybody's talking about this week, next week, well, we're over that. We're not even talking about it anymore. And so it's important to, try and keep that in mind as we're looking at things and making decisions. They need to oftentimes be a little bit longer term view.
And for my parting comment, I think the biggest thing I would say to look at would be the pandemic, frankly, because the story of the past 2 years has been, both in terms of our politics and our economy, has been the pandemic. We saw recently where we thought that things were bouncing back a couple times, actually. Last summer, we thought that was the case. More recently, we thought that was the case, like in December. And then we had these variants emerge that kind of put us back on our heels. Now we have the vaccinations, although our vaccination rate, frankly, is probably too low to really address the virus, but there are new treatments coming out for the virus. And all these things could make the virus much more something that we manage as an endemic problem, kind of like the flu or other diseases that we have ongoing, as opposed to kind of the crisis that we have that completely devastates the economy the way that it has in the past. And if we're able to kind of make that shift into a world where we're not constantly having to shut down our economy anymore, I think we're going to see things return a lot more to some sense of normalcy than we've been experiencing for the past couple of years.
Thanks again, Mike and Janelle. Really appreciate your time, sharing your expertise with us. Thanks again to our audience for being here. Keep an eye out for more office hours and other events from the Center for Civic Engagement or for that matter, professional and continuing education at OU, the Alumni Association at OU, lots of stuff always happening on campus. Folks in the community are always welcome to those. We want you on campus. We want to see you here. We have an office hours coming up 4 weeks from today, political hot topics, where we'll talk redistricting, we'll talk campaign 2022, probably presidential approval, all those fun topics. That'll be an evening session. So come back around 7 o'clock 1 month from today. Hope to see you there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Dave. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.